Here we are in the same test scene and we are going to talk about lightning, which is very important because no matter how good your shaders are, no matter how good you get in material creation, if there is no decent lighting behind all that, it will not look good. And basically where almost every beginner makes a mistake, he puts randomly lights in the scene and hopes for the best. And actually the best approach to good lighting is really to observe how light behaves in the nature. If you really want to achieve a specific effect that you saw somewhere, try to dissect that image, try to see from where the actual light is coming from, how bright it is. Is it maybe colored? Is it dim? Does it influence the whole scene? So there is so many things about lighting and it's really hard to squeeze them in one little lesson, but let's give it a shot. Almost always you will have to have the main light, the key light, the main light source that illuminates your scene. And there is some sort of a standard 3-point light setup, which is a good starting point for a user to get a decent grasp on lighting. So if I do a test render here, you will see that my object, I have to just enable shadows, it will help a bit. Let's set it to area and tune this accuracy down so we cut down on the render times. And firstly, if you are going to use the main light, which will face the object directly, it is a bad idea and I will show you why. Really, to get this light to point exactly on this object from our perspective, we'll just create a camera, and the camera will be made exactly where we are at the moment. But it won't be active until you click this little gizmo here, so it means you will be using this camera for the moving in viewport rather than this default editor camera. And let's activate it now, and you will see that those green lines are gone, so it means it is activated. Okay, so we can click off, so it means we are not using it right now. The reason I created this camera because this is an easy approach to position the lights exactly where your current view is. So just select your light and simply go here under functions, transfer, and simply drop the camera as your target, and the light will come here. We render now. We'll see a difference in let's say in intensity of the light, and you can already see that this sphere looks really flat. It doesn't look like it has depth. Let me just show you another trick with area lights and lights in general. We have option here under cameras to link active object, and if you do that, then you will be able to manipulate your object and see through it. Currently I'm using light as my point of view. So see, I'm actually moving the light. Yes? So this is really useful. Let me render this now. And you see the sphere looks really flat. The shadows are behind the object. You can't really say is there a back part of it, and that is not good. So let me undo all that. So I'll go here under undo view. Maybe a few times more. Actually, it will be a better idea to revert first scene so we have a decent start. Okay, so that's much better than manually doing. Generally, you put the main light in some sort of an angle to an object, so it can be on the right side or on the left side. Don't restrain yourself from using it directly from the camera. Okay, that gives a really flat result. Let me enable those shadows again and tune down accuracy and do a small test render. You see, this material is actually 242 RGB material, which we discussed in our calibration scene. And now You can see that this object has some sort of a volume, casts shadows, there is a backend to it, there is some sort of contrast on the surface, and it looks nice for now. Well, the main light is the one that gives the mood to a scene. First, when you create a light, create your main light source. That is absolutely a must do always in every single scene. Rather than really following blindly and being a slave to some sort of light setups and light tricks and some sort of photographic ideas how should lighting be, by my humble opinion, much better to really visualize in your head what you actually want to achieve. So for example, in this situation now, I really don't like this too dark part of the sphere, and this shadows looks really too dark to me. So I would rather put additional light here that will get some light, and it will slightly diffuse this really dark black to something more acceptable like gray, which would be much more realistic in this case. Okay, so I will do just that. I will create a spotlight in this case. So mainly if you're creating support lights, and support light means that it adds additional lighting to fix what this main light is unable to do. And I can now go here under cameras and link active object, and I will be actually looking through my light, and I can position my light exactly as I want. And this is really neat trick without having to resort to all sorts of tricks and manually positioning. This is much more easier, and it gives a really nice visual feedback where the actual light is. Okay, something like this. To exit this mode, just simply go here back in editor, camera, like this. I do a test render now. You can now see actually without even measuring that this is a little bit overblown and it's washed out. So I will tune down the intensity of the light. Always start with the half of what you have. That's a really good idea. I want to change this fall off type to inverse square physically accurate because this light is already set up like that. So I want to follow the main same general rule. Okay, I want to have physically accurate results. And this looks acceptable, but it really diffused these shadows too much. So I will tune it down a bit more. So let's say something like maybe 25. And let's see what we get. And maybe this could work. So we have a nice transition from black to shades of gray, and it becomes much more darker here as it moves away. Okay, this is acceptable for now. And you can always disable your main light to see what actually your support light does. And I will name them. This will be my main light, and this will be my support, or whatever you want to enter here. And I can enable this again. And this is what I currently have. This shadow is a bit grainy, but we shouldn't worry about it right now. I will explain the shadow on the main light source, of course. And this accuracy is low just to speed up render so we can follow more clearly. The next thing I want to do is to add a backlight. Backlight is often used to separate an object from the background, so you have some sort of a depth in there. I'll do that really quickly so the results may not be as you expected. I will just control drag this support light and create a copy. Okay, so I will name it backlight, and also play with this link active object, and I will go somewhere around back, and it's always a good idea to put it somewhere around here, so it's basically over the object and behind the object, so it would illuminate this upper part. It all depends what you want to achieve. So let's go to editor camera and try our test render. And let's see what we have for now. And I will disable all lights except backlight so I can actually see what it does. And here it illuminates this upper portion of the sphere, which is really what I want. And always check how those lights work combined. And you can see now that this backlight is a little bit too bright as opposed to this support light. So I will tune it down a bit. Let's say something around 20 perhaps, just to have uniform lighting here, or even slightly lighter. So something like this could work. Okay, let's see. And we have a really nice result. So sphere now really looks like a sphere, and you can tell it's a sphere. So we can even enhance this a bit more. I will select them all while holding Control, and here under details we have the fall offset to inverse square. That is correct, but there is this contrast setting, and I always tend to experiment with that setting. So in positive values, not in negative. Negative values produce somewhat odd results. So I always start with 50% here to see how the gradations and the overall contrast will behave in the scene. And I tend to lower it from that point, for example, something like 40, until I have a really good representation of this surface. If I render this to picture viewer, you can now see we are basically in a maximum of our calibrated scene. So we will find the 242 value somewhere here. Let me delete all this and I will show you something that is really nice. Let's disable these two lights and only leave our main light and do a test render in the picture viewer. So this is what we started with. And now we will enable these guys back again and do another test render. So here under compare, you have an option to set two images, one as A, one as B, and you can compare them. And it's much easier to select the first one, press A on your keyboard, and the second one, and press B, and do a compare here. So let me A-B compare. And here we have difference checked. So it shows the difference between two renders. If I disable this, I will actually get a line and I can really show you how this is different. So now shadows are really not that hard, and there is some sort of a volume. You have really a feeling of depth to that with support and backlight. It becomes more pronounced when used color. So let me copy this material and drop in a, let's say, a red color maybe here, something like this. I will replace this material. Let's do a test render here. You can already see it makes even bigger difference in colored materials. And do that and show you something else which is really important. To add a specific feeling to a scene, you will use a slight colorization in the light. Restrain yourself from using really saturated color scale. Let me show you why. So for example, if you enter here really saturated, let's try with blue color, and you will see what happens. It completely pollutes the scene and the object, and any material you will have here will be completely replaced by that color. So really use small values here. So something like, if you set it to completely white first, just add a small percentage of a color you intend. For example, 5% is often more than enough. So let's try 5%. So immediately I will try with 10 just to emphasize that a bit more and show you what I mean. So now with this bluish color, we effectively cooled the scene. So use bluish and greenish colors for outdoor scenes when it's daylight without sunlight. If there is a sunlight, you can use warmer colors. So you can warm up the scene simply by adding something that is maybe reddish or yellowish, something like this. and you will completely change the mood in the scene. This is more like a sepia effect. Let's try something more in this red spectrum. Okay, it's really pronounced, and I already told you small values play a significant role. So we warmed it up a little as opposed to this blue one. So let's do a test render with this one. This is sort of a warm. I'll delete these two guys and go here to somewhere blue and do a test render with that. I will compare those two guys. And you can see this is a cool scene and this is a warm scene. Okay? And naturally you can play with this support and backlight colorization just to add subtle effects to your renders. With all this said, there is actually no recipe for a good lighting. One should know what is bad lighting when the scene is not lit enough, when the scene is over bright, unless you are going for some artistic look. When the colors are washed, that is not good at all. So it's really difficult to say what is good. That generally always visualize, observe the image. You probably have an image in your head you are trying to achieve. Try to see from where the light is really actually coming from and play with the settings until you get that effect. Usually while using this area type of lights, often one or maximum 2 or 3 lights are just enough for the scene. And remember, the more lights you have in the scene, the more render time you add to your final image. Okay, so now I think it's a good time to talk about something about shadows. So let's do a test render here. And I will explain this minimum and maximum samples. As you can see, the shadow is grainy, and it's grainy because there is not enough samples for Cinema 4D to work with. We gave it maximum of 100 sample for these shadows, and the minimum amount of samples is 8. So if we enter something like 500 here, let's see what happens. You can see the render time is really increased, and along recording this tutorial, it really bogs down the computer. Okay, so you can see the shadow definition is much better, and I would probably need to increase this minimum samples to something like 20 to get some really nice results. And this accuracy doesn't mean if you set this to 100% that it will give 100% correct result. This accuracy is a value that reflects only these two settings. So you can really put it to something like 50% and add something like 20 here and see what you get. Okay, so now when it's finished, you can actually see that this shadow is much more defined and it bleeds somewhat on display, and it looks really realistic. Okay, so the area shadow type is much more realistic and it behaves like in the real world as opposed to other shadows type. The downside of the area shadow is that it's a lot of render time. So again, these minimum samples and maximum samples, you will find this setting inside Cinema 4D on various places. So this is a somewhat of a clipped range. So you are saying Cinema 4D, you can throw samples for whatever you're doing, but in this range. I hope you understand it. Otherwise, if Cinema could use any number in minimum samples and any number in maximum samples, it will completely blow out your render times into days or even weeks. Okay, so you have to limit her. That's it. You just have to limit. Observe when the shadows or anything you will work on later, for example with caustics and something like that, observe that you have good results. Never mind the numbers. If the results are good and the values are low, even better. Okay, I will talk even about something different. Let me apply this material, and I think it's the time to tell you about it. Let's see how much the render is lasting. It really eats up on the render time. So I will show you something else. I will disable this render for now, and here I often don't use this specular and specular color channel if I want realistic results. Why? Because I can actually produce real specular scenes in 4D without faking them. So here in specular and specular color channels, it's all faking. Let me just position this a bit, and so you can see more clearly. I'll add a small amount of reflection because speculars really tend to show only in reflections, just like a real world. So we will add, let's say, something like 30. You see now currently this object is completely reflective, which is not possible, and completely eats the color channel. So let's tune that down to something like 30. Okay, and do a test render and see what we have. Just give it a second till we render it, and we have a nice shiny plastic ball. The problem is, in the real world you would actually see a light source reflecting here, and that is specular. That is actually what specular is. And luckily here under light details you can enable that feature, and it is right here, show in reflection. So let's see the change right now. Okay, so you can see the effect here, but it's really in small intensity, so we will have to increase that value. So there is a visibility multiplier for this show in reflection, and let's try something like 500 and render it out, and there it is, much more vivid, and it looks more realistic. Prior to actually showing you how to build some materials, let me just show you this. Almost every reflective material has some sort of a blurriness applied to it. Really not many materials that actually have really clear reflection. So you can try with a 10% blur on this very same reflection on this sphere and see what you get. We will wait a bit. And while we are waiting, you can see already have minimum and maximum sample settings here and accuracy, just like in the lights, so you can experiment with it also. So minimum and maximum samples and accuracy is really common inside Cinema 4D. Okay, so we can see that our specular is a bit dimmed here. It's really soft and it looks really natural, and it's really eye-pleasing. And if we increase this to, let's say, 50% and wait for it to render, we'll get somewhat different result, but it will be really interesting. So now when it's really blurred, it will be really soft. But remember, for really good blurriness effect, you have to increase this minimum and maximum samples quite a bit. Okay? So now with just a simple increase in the value here in the blurriness, we completely alter the way this material looks. Now it looks like some sort of maybe a plastic rubbery ball. And let me show you just one more thing before we delve into material creation, which will be really interesting lesson. I will delete this red guy, we don't need it. Just to show you something that is really interesting. Here under light, you can actually use a gradient here. So you can define which color will be at the start of the light. So let's, for example, demonstrate that. You can use violet light at the start and maybe some crazy combination of, let's say, violet and orange light. And we will get a nice gradient in between. So let's render that. Let's see what it does to our scene. And it's a bit more violet since this light is really casting its influence really in big radius, you can't actually see this orangey, but let's put the orangey really close and see what happens. And you can now see that this gradient here is starting to appear right here. So this gradient is really useful when you want to fake effects like dusk or dawn or something like that. It's really useful. So once again, don't be a slave to a setting. Don't put your lights randomly in the scene and hope for the best. Really try to position that single light. Firstly, that single main light where you actually want it. You must have a mental image in your head prior to doing something in 3D. And it's always good to sketch roughly on a piece of paper what you are trying to achieve. So this was really just a somewhat of a basic intro to lightning. Okay, so let's delve into material creation.